Hello, my name is Tara Ronsleben, and I think we should talk about toxic masculinity. Okay, hey, pitchforks down. Let's look at the order of those words before we get upset. I'm not saying that all masculinity is toxic, because what is masculinity anyway? I could describe someone as competent and confident and strong and kind and caring, and that person could easily be a man or a woman, despite some of those traits being ascribed to one gender over another. But this gray area of gender and the way it links to personality leaves room for a rather insidious, or toxic, one might say, ideology to develop that treats masculinity not as a collection of traits that are common in those who identify as men, but as a means of domination through subjugation of others, in this case mostly women, trans and non-binary folk, and men who may not ascribe to this very narrow definition of masculinity, either through the way they express their gender or the way they behave. It's also often tied up in racism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia. This is what we describe as toxic masculinity. It's a definition of masculinity that roots itself in antagonism, in defining itself by what it is not. Not soft, not weak, not vulnerable, not gay, not black, not Jewish, not feminine. And to do that requires dehumanizing everyone else in order to validate yourself. And even the most extremes of this ideology, ideas that if laid out on paper, the average person would say are insane, are so embedded in the everyday, especially for young people, that it can be hard to recognize. In speaking with a young family member, a 12-year-old boy, he admits that the same sort of name-calling rooted in misogyny and homophobia still exists that I encountered as a kid, as did generations before me and before them, and so on. Being called a girl is still an insult. Being called gay is still an insult. He insists that while he never uses them, they're just jokes, and the kids who do say these things don't mean anything deeper by them, but the roots of these jokes are centered in masculinity. To be perceived as anything unmasculine is an insult. It requires bringing down anyone unmasculine in order to place masculinity on a pedestal. Patriarchy, by definition, requires pedestalizing masculinity in order to maintain a hierarchy. And while there are through lines in the ways that masculinity has been idolized and idealized throughout history, the current definitions of masculinity within American culture have become exceedingly narrow, to the point that most men can't live up to them. Take the alpha male, for example. Beyond the thesis of an alpha being based in bunk science around the ways that wolf packs organize themselves, the term alpha male has become a dog whistle for toxic masculinity. Search alpha male on Google, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, the card catalog at your local library, and you will find thousands of results telling you how to stop being a weak, effeminate beta male and start being a real alpha. The first step for most of them, of course, being to pull out your credit card and buy their self-published book or 8-step online course. Then many of the rules for being an alpha male either lean toward platitudes with no real depth behind them, things like just be confident, just stop caring what other people think, just be rich and attractive. Or they borrow heavily from source material like The Game, a manual on how targeting women's insecurities in mass ensures at least one of them may sleep with you. Media around alpha males relies heavily on determining value in men by their financial earnings and their sexual prowess, and in women by their submissive-ness.
So why would a man accept you when you're older and you've had more experience?
What?
Why would a man want you when you're older and you've dated more men?
Why would he want me?
Yeah.
I don't know, cause he likes my personality.
The answer is no, he won't want you.
What?
The answer is no, he won't want you. Men want younger girls that aren't.
Beyond the obvious misogyny here, this is not only damaging to the women they're talking to and about, this is harmful for the boys and men who are receiving and internalizing these messages. because often the feminine qualities that they are defining masculinity as an absence of are positive qualities. Boys are told from a very young age to not be like girls, to not be emotional, to not cry, to not play with dolls, to not show qualities like empathy, gentleness, sensitivity, vulnerability. But these qualities are not inherently feminine, they're human, and as a result, boys are taught from a young age to repress any expression of these emotions, and then ultimately these emotions themselves, with the exception of anger, one of the only emotions that men are encouraged to express. Adding to that allowed anger is the expectation that not only must you not be feminine, you must be masculine in the way these self-described alpha males are masculine. The trick to all of this is that anyone who describes themselves as the alpha male is going to set themselves up as an unattainable goal. They don't actually want you to also be an alpha male, because if everyone's an alpha, then no one's an alpha. So then boys and young men are stuck between a rock and a hard place and need an outlet for the pressures imposed by this system. The answer is obvious. If the rock is never being like a girl because girls are inferior, and the hard place prides itself on being misogynistic, the outlet for all of that anger, the one thing that they can express, isn't going to be the actual issue, the system that failed them, but the one thing that masculinity is defining itself against: women. In 2015, Elliot Rodgers killed 7, including himself, and injured 14 more as a result of being an angry, disturbed man caught between that rock and hard place. Before beginning his act of misogynistic terrorism, he uploaded a video on his YouTube channel where he detailed his motivations for his impending violence. He wanted revenge against humanity because girls had never been attracted to him, and that just wasn't fair. He felt that he was owed sexual attention because he was a man, the supreme gentleman in his own words. Elliot Rodgers was incredibly lonely, but he only knew how to express that loneliness through anger and violence. And yet for many, Elliot Rodgers is not a terrorist, but a hero. There are communities of incels, short for involuntarily celibate, who revere Elliot Rodgers and his acts of violence. Also in 2015, Chris Harper Mercer killed 10, including himself, after regularly expressing anger over his lack of sexual success on incel forums. In 2017, William Edward Atchison killed 3, including himself, at a high school, having previously praised Elliot Rodgers online. In 2018, also inspired by Elliot Rodgers, Alex Manassian killed 10 and injured 15 by ramming them with his vehicle. In 2020, in Arizona, Armando Hernandez, who identified as an incel online, injured 3 in a shooting at a mall. This is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to violent crimes based in misogyny. These are acts of terror, and they don't even touch upon crimes related to intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, murder, and sexual assault. But women are not the only casualties of this mentality. The loneliness that led to these violence acts impacts almost all men. In a recent study on the decline of close, intimate, platonic friendships, they found that 15% of men surveyed claimed that they had 0 people in their lives that they considered close friends. That means 1 to 2 out of every 10 men have no close friends. Even of those with only a few close friends, say 3 or fewer, over half of those reported feeling lonely and isolated within the last week. Men are statistically much more likely to conceal physical pain or illness, and more likely to die from suicide, because not only are they lonely, they fear being perceived as weak or vulnerable by seeking help. And men of color face even more barriers when it comes to seeking help due to systemic racism and cultural stigma. And when men do seek help, like through therapy, they may not even be able to receive the full extent of the help they need due to what's called normative male alexithymia. Normative male alexithymia is the inability of men to put emotions into words posited to result from traditional masculine role socialization and reflected in the endorsement of and conformity to traditional masculine norms. Because feeling and expressing emotions are actions repressed from childhood, therapy may be the first place men are asked to access and communicate their emotional needs. Many men who don't or can't access therapy find that romantic relationships become their one outlet for emotional intimacy, creating a dynamic where their partner must act as a friend, a therapist, a mother, a secretary, on top of being a girlfriend, because they don't have any platonic, intimate relationships outside of their romantic relationship. This codependence leaves little room for a dynamic where one partner isn't overwhelmed by emotional labor on behalf of the other. The man in this hypothetical cisgender heterosexual relationship is then left vacillating between a codependent dynamic with their romantic partner and purely functional relationships with others. UK-based psychotherapist Adrian Wilson-Smith sees how common this lack of intimate platonic relationships is in men. There are a lot of men having functional relationships with other men, he says. I know this guy because he can help me out with my business idea, or partying. These are the guys I go out with for a drink or a line of coke. But enduring friendships of the kind seen in many female-to-female friendships are not something that most men over 40 see any need to have. Younger men also struggle when it comes to forming enduring friendships. This is why those incel forums and alpha male podcasts have such huge communities around them. It's in human nature to seek community, but that normative male alexithymia that prevents expressing your emotional needs within the context of a therapy session also prevents building the same sort of emotional intimacy that exists within those aforementioned female-to-female enduring friendships. Anger and misogyny are what fuels those communities and your acceptance into them. And anger and misogyny are easy to access when you exist in a culture that fosters them as a means of expressing masculinity. And I think it's important to note that a lot of these communities are primarily online, adding another layer between the person sitting at the computer and the vulnerability of connecting with another human being. As noted by Stanford psychiatrist and author of Virtually You, The Dangerous Powers of the E-Personality, Dr. Elias Abujayedi, online anonymity makes a user much more likely to open up in relation to taboo instincts and dark desires, and also much more likely to exhibit gratuitous aggression. But in an increasingly isolated world where community is difficult to access, it makes sense that these spaces appeal to lonely young men and boys. In that conversation with the young family member I spoke of at the beginning, questions about the video game he was playing were met with enthusiastic breakdowns of lore and mechanics, but questions about relationships with other boys where problems and feelings could be discussed were met with short, nonchalant, I don't know, we don't talk about that kind of stuff. And yet, despite having a large friend group that most adult men don't have, face-to-face interactions between those friends outside of school was nearly non-existent. And a sense of loneliness was apparent in the way that he resisted me heading out and instead insisted on me sitting down and playing a video game with him for another hour or so. Another question posed to my 12-year-old interviewee was who he looked up to, who he admired and wanted to be like. This, like any of the other questions that required a degree of emotional vulnerability, was met with a shrug. No one. And while some teen boys may be able to name a sports star or a musician that they look up to, I imagine it is incredibly difficult for boys and young men to find a role model. This is another way in which toxic forms of masculinity sneak into the everyday for young men. Adolescence and young adulthood are difficult times. Hormonal surges mean tons of shifting feelings and moods, and The prefrontal cortex is a decade away from fully maturing. School environments act as amplified microcosms of the real world, with social hierarchies feeling like permanent placement tests that determine how important you are as a person. This is combined with external pressures to make decisions about your future when your cognitive processes are just trying to make it past lunch period. We're told, mostly through coming-of-age tropes in media, that being a teenager and a young adult is all about finding yourself and figuring out who you are and what you want. But that's tough. I'm turning 30 this year and I don't know who I am. I'm still working on it. And I'm pretty sure that's the point. We're all still working on it and always will be. But the pressure to identify and categorize yourself during adolescence is apparent. And that makes teenagers an easy target for marketing to. When the extent of the positive messaging you receive is just be yourself, that can feel like a Herculean task to even figure out what that means. So when the TikTok or Instagram ad pops up and says, follow these 10 steps and you'll become the ideal man, that's the obvious option, right? Even if those 10 steps involve mentalities that will ultimately harm you and the people around you. That's why it's so imperative to offer examples from as early as humanly possible of positive masculinity and femininity alike. We know that gender roles and expectations begin before a child even enters the world, usually through burning down forests at gender reveal parties. We also know that gendered expectations and behaviors start manifesting by the time a kid can hold their own head up. Creating a pro-social environment, one in which it is encouraged and rewarded to act in ways that are empathetic and benefit everyone, allows for masculinity and femininity to develop in their truest nature. One that does not seek to dominate another in order to lift itself up, but one that encourages the positive qualities in everyone. Because community and connection and empathy shouldn't be gendered experiences. They should be human ones.